Resuming debate, the honourable member for Etobicoke Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as we begin our debate here this evening, I note that tomorrow morning the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement will be debated in the Verkhovna Rada, Ukraine's parliament. And I issue a challenge to Speaker Parubey in Ukraine's parliament and our colleagues and a sign of friendship to see which parliament will pass this free trade agreement first. But more seriously, Mr. Speaker, this past July, as the chair of the Canada-Ukraine Parliamentary Friendship Group, and as a Ukrainian Canadian, I had the honour of bearing witness to the historic signing of the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement in the Presidential Ceremonial Hall in Kyiv. I would like to thank our Prime Minister for including me in the delegation, and more importantly, for making this state visit and signing a priority for our new government. In fact, it was the Prime Minister's first one-on-one state visit of his term after his visit to the United States. And this will most likely be the first free trade agreement to be ratified by our government. Watching my fellow Ukrainian Canadian, the former Minister of International Trade, sign the treaty was especially poignant, as we had first met in Kyiv in 1992 as young and idealistic Canadians who were intent on making a difference in the ancestral homeland of our parents and grandparents. The Minister as a journalist, and myself a Canadian organizer of Ruch, Ukraine's Democratic Front. 25 years later, the Minister worked hard to make this free trade agreement a reality. 25 years later, we accompanied Canada's Prime Minister for the signing of this historic agreement. Mr. Speaker, why would the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement be a priority for our country? Our bilateral trade has been a modest $289 million on average for the past 5 years. Why was CUFTA's implementation specifically referred to in the previous International Trade Minister's mandate letter? And why would this free trade agreement be the sole such agreement to have the unanimous support of this current House? Mr. Speaker, it's because not every free trade agreement is just about trade. It must be seen through various lenses, one of which is Canada's special relationship with Ukraine. Internationally, and in this House, everyone is aware of Canada's and Ukraine's special relationship. However, the word special is not just an adjective, but a term defined in an agreement in 1994, the joint declaration of a special partnership between Canada and Ukraine, an agreement which was reaffirmed in 2001 and again in 2008. As well, Ukraine is one of 25 countries of focus for the Canadian International Development Agency, CIDA. Although Canadians and our symbol of the maple leaf are warmly received in almost every country of the planet, there is no country where Canadians are more warmly, in fact affectionately, welcomed than in Ukraine. Many of us literally stood shoulder to shoulder with the people of Ukraine during the independence movement of 1988 to 91 and the democratic revolutions, the Orange Revolution of 2004 and the Revolution of Dignity of 2014. I cannot relate to this House and the Canadian people how often during these historic events Ukrainians, upon hearing that I was from Canada, would embrace me and say, "Thank you, Canada. Please say thank you to the people of Canada from us." For the past 25 years, tens of thousands of Ukrainian Canadians, as well as many of their Canadian friends, have directly engaged in building democracy in Ukraine. In many ways, my personal story of engagement in Ukraine's difficult journey towards freedom began in earnest in the summer of 1991, on the centenary of Ukrainian immigration to Canada. A group of youthful Ukrainian Canadians traveled into Ukraine's eastern Donbas region, the front line of the current Russo-Ukrainian war. It was the time of Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost, when the Iron Curtain had been slightly drawn, allowing in the winds of change. For most in the Soviet Union, especially in the regions, it was like the wind rustling leaves at the tops of trees. You could hear it in the distance, but you couldn't feel it down on the ground. Our group of Ukrainian Canadians decided to head into a region which had been amongst the most devastated by Soviet rule. The epicenter of the Holodomor, the genocide by famine of the Ukrainian people. A region whose churches had mostly been dynamited generations ago under Stalin's decrees. A region in which history, the past, had been destroyed. In whose libraries and schools history began with the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. A coal mining and heavily industrialized region which was also amongst the Soviet Union's most ecologically devastated. It was here, to a region formerly closed to Westerners, that we brought Ukrainian and Russian language copies of Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms and pamphlets describing our multicultural nation. It was also in this region that we had a glimpse into the future. It was here that in various towns during the span of a week, I'd been taken in for so-called conversations by Communist Party first secretaries, the local KGB, and police. At times, conversations were theoretical. Sometimes they were quite threatening, and others were almost pleasant. Mr. Speaker, I recollect one particular incident where the police came. We had set up our little table with copies of Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and the police came and took me to meet with the first party secretary, Communist Party secretary, in his offices. And as I sat there, he was intent on showing me a model of a Lenin monument that he was going to build in his town of Milove, near the Russian border, and today near the front of the Russo-Ukrainian war. And as I listened to him, I saw out his window how a fire truck that looked like it was built in the 50s pulled up, and it had a nozzle, almost like a tank turret, which it pointed at our Ukrainian Canadians standing at the little table with their Canadian flag and copies of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And as I was watching that out of the corner of the eye, I mentioned to the First Party Secretary, wouldn't it be better for him to be spending resources not on this grand monument to Lenin? I said, you know, it may be that in the next few years, that monument may be taken down. No matter how they might laud him in Moscow, wouldn't it be better for him to spend those resources on local schools or to fix the potholed streets of his town? In all of these conversations with officials, I noticed there was a plan formulating. They spoke of how Ukraine was not really a country, and if Ukraine were to become independent, it would split up into regions. In fact, the same map was produced in different towns showing a small truncated Ukraine and a Novaya Rossiya, New Russia, a republic which encompassed all of Ukraine south and east. Later in Luhansk, the capital of the current so-called Luhansk People's Republic, I met Don Cossacks, who had come from Russia's Rostov-on-Don, who were, after selling me a Cossack hat for $10, confided to me that they were actually soldiers sent in from a Russian military unit in friendship. As I've previously stated, my experiences are just one example of the thousands of such personal experiences of Ukrainian Canadians in Ukraine. However, the ties between Ukraine and Canada run much deeper than the personal contributions of Ukrainian Canadians over the past 25 years. You see, Ukraine has given Canada its most precious of gifts, its people. 1.3 million Canadians trace their ancestral roots to Ukraine. Next year marks our 150th anniversary. Last year, Ukrainians marked the 125th anniversary of the arrival of the first Ukrainian pioneers in Canada's prairies. These pioneers transformed the bush of the prairies into the golden wheat fields of Manitoba, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. As one travels the vastness of the prairies, the golden paysage is regularly broken by grain elevators and the domes of Ukrainian churches. In fact, there isn't a city in Canada where golden church domes don't testify to the presence of Ukrainian Canadians. They testify to the perseverance industry, and spirituality of Ukrainian Canadians. The ribbons of steels of the Canadian Pacific Railway bound our vast confederation together. It was largely Ukrainian Canadians that filled that prairie vastness. Their presence countered the movement of American settlers north, who, as had their southern brethren in Texas, California, and other states previously, were posing sovereignty threats to their northern neighbor. Canada may well have had a very different geography if not for the government's policy of the time of free land to the people in sheepskin coats. However, Ukrainian Canadians did not only transform our landscape, they gave us a deeper understanding of who we are as a nation. The term multiculturalism was first used by Senator Paul Yuzek in his maiden Senate speech in 1963. And the Ukrainian Canadian Committee, as the Congress was called at that time, lobbied the federal government through the 1960s on this issue, a government of the time whose official policy was biculturalism. It was due to these determined efforts that former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau officially announced the federal policy of multiculturalism in 1971, thus transforming our understanding of Canada and who we are as a people. Today, in a world of resurgent xenophobia and nativism, Canada stands as an aspirational city on a hill amongst liberal democracies. Our multiculturalism, our strength in diversity, a shining example to a world of darkening chauvinism and increasing divisions. Ukrainian Canadians' contributions to Canada, both in numbers and in length of time, qualifies us as one of this country's founding peoples. It is why when Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov referred to us as a rabid diaspora in January of last year while ranting against Canada's steadfast policy of standing with Ukraine, that his denunciation was responded to by Canada's Foreign Minister's statement of January 27th last year in this House. Minister Dion stated, "I am so pleased to express the steadfast support of Canada for Ukraine. How much we deeply disagree with the invasion and interference of the Russian government in Ukraine, and also how much we will not tolerate from a Russian minister any insults against the community of Ukraine and Canada. We owe so much to Ukrainian Canadians, and we will always support them." It must also be seen through a geopolitical lens in a world in which Ukraine has been the victim of military invasion and annexation of her territory by a Russia that does not subscribe to international treaties on the sanctity of borders, a violation of accords that have largely brought a grand peace to Europe since World War II. And it must be understood in the context of the 2014 Ukrainian Revolution of Dignity, a modern revolution by a people of 45 million in support of liberal democratic values and in support of their dream to be part of a multilateral European Union of states with enshrined universal human and democratic rights. Today, Russia poses the gravest geopolitical threat to liberal democracy in the West, and Ukraine and her people are literally on the front line. When Putin ordered his armies to militarily invade and annex Ukrainian territory, he broke a fundamental principle of international rule of law, the sanctity of borders. We've not seen European borders change through military force since the 1930s. 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers, mostly volunteers, and civilians have been killed by invading Russian soldiers and their proxies. 2 million Ukrainians are currently internally displaced. In annexed Crimea, Muslim Tatar leaders continue to disappear. Why did Putin invade? It was because the people of Ukraine chose liberty and democracy. Ukraine's revolution of dignity was a revolt against a new enslavement by the kleptocratic President Yanukovych, puppet of a dictatorial Kremlin. It was the first time in the history of the European Union that people, including student demonstrators, were shot by snipers, killed while carrying the European flag, Union flag, a symbol of the Western democratic values that we cherish. These protesters were not only a threat to the puppet President Yanukovych and Putin's revanchist imperial vision, As the Russian president watched Kyiv's Maidan, with hundreds of thousands of citizens building barricades, he envisioned the contagion of the revolution of dignity spreading, infecting Russians. Since 2000, Putin has methodically dismantled Russia's nascent democracy and created a new Russian dictatorship. At least 132 investigative journalists have been silenced in Russia through murder. Opposition leaders such as Borys Nemtsov symbolically assassinated outside the Kremlin walls. FSB defectors such as British citizen Litvinenko gruesomely poisoned by radioactive polonium in London, England. Glorious patriotic war started in Chechnya in 2000, Georgia in 2005, Ukraine in 2014. However, Russia's war against Ukraine is not only imperial revanchism, it's to create a terrifying example of Ukraine for his own Russian people, a dismembered, failed democratic state. The Kremlin has not only declared war militarily against Ukraine, and there's not only just an ongoing propaganda war, there's a Kremlin economic war against Ukraine. Russia had been Ukraine's largest trading partner, equivalent in importance to Canada's economic relationship with the United States. At the same time that Russia militarily invaded, Putin shut down trade with Ukraine. It is why the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement is of such importance. It's a clear statement of support by Canada for Ukraine at a time of Kremlin military aggression and economic war. It's not just a reaffirmation of our government's policy in regards to free trade, it's a geopolitical statement of support. Having earlier noted the current modest levels of trade, we should not dismiss the opportunities that it affords to the business communities of both countries, especially for small and medium-sized businesses. Ukraine, with her free trade association with the EU, can be the entry point for Canadian low-cost capital investment and low manufacturing costs on the European continent, a de facto gateway into the European market. And Canada can become a gateway for nascent small and medium-sized Ukrainian businesses to expand and invest in Canada as an entry point into the North American market. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I note that CUFTA is but one effective tool in a policy kit to strengthen democracy in Ukraine and to contain Putin's plan to create a democratic failed state of Ukraine. We must renew and broaden Project Unifier, our military training mission in Ukraine. However, while standing with Ukraine, we must also strengthen our resolve to stand shoulder to shoulder with Russia's embattled yet courageous democratic opposition. Madam Speaker, this past week, I received the terrible news that my friend, Vladimir Kara-Murza, had been hospitalized in Russia due to acute intoxication by an unknown substance, poisoning. My prayers are with Vladimir and my thoughts with his wife, Evgenia, and their 3 children. Vladimir had testified before the Foreign Affairs Committee in Ottawa this past spring, stating that Canadian Magnitsky sanctions for gross human rights abusers would be a pro-Russian measure. He was joined on the panel of witnesses by Zhana Nemtsova, the daughter of the late Borys Nemtsov, also an acquaintance of mine, who'd come to Canada's Parliament in 2012 to testify in support of Magnitsky legislation and was assassinated 2 years ago on February 27th, and by Bill Browder, whose lawyer said Magnitsky had been tortured and killed in a Russian prison for uncovering, documenting, and reporting a massive fraud against the Russian people by individuals sanctioned by President Putin. Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, we must join our American legislative colleagues in sanctioning gross human rights abusers by expanding our Special Economic Measures Act to build upon the U.S. Jackson-Vanik repeal and the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act of 2012. Madam Speaker, I conclude by thanking Canada on behalf of all Ukrainian Canadians. This has been freedom's shores and the land of opportunities for waves of Ukrainian immigrants for over 125 years. This is the land in which our ancestors, with their perseverance, industry, built new lives, and in building their lives, helped to build and transform our great country, Canada. They built a future in their new homeland. However, they never forgot their ancestral roots, who they were, and where they came from. The Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement is a hand of friendship and solidarity by Canada to a country, Ukraine, which gave its most precious resource, its human resources, its people to us. Long may our special relationship endure. Slava Canadi, Slava Ukraini.
And comments, questions et commentaires. The honourable member.